Welcome everyone to the LBS Wheeler Institute for Business and Development COVID-19 series. Today we are honored and privileged and lucky to have with us Imran Rasul. Imran Rasul, Professor of Economics at the University College London, is one of the leading scholars in development economics, public economics and labor, having done path-breaking research both on issues related to public and labor in low-income countries and frontier economies, as well as in more rich industrial economies. Imran has also a remarkable service to the profession, having served for many years as the leading editor of the Review of Economic Studies, while currently he serves as the managing editor of the Journal of the European Economic Association, the flagship journal of the European Economic Association. Imran has many accomplishments. Among others, he has been awarded by the ISA Prize for the Best Young Labour Economist, and very recently he got awarded the Johansson Prize by the European Economic Association, an award given every 2 years to the very best Euro-based economist by the age of 45. Most importantly for our series, Imran has been working over the past couple of years on some very topical to the COVID-19 issues. He has a very interesting paper that we want to discuss with him today about the Zika epidemic in Brazil and how businesses and households responded to that. And he has also done some very interesting work about the impact of the Ebola crisis in Western Africa. So without further notice, let me pass the floor to Imran. Imran, thank you very much for joining us. It's a really honor and privilege to have you around with us.
My pleasure.
I suggest that before you tell us about your paper, why don't you give us some description about the Zika epidemic that hit Brazil, if I'm not mistaken, back in 2015.
So I think, just to put this in wider context, I started this research agenda when it became clear to me that there was a set of aggregate shocks related to pathogens or epidemics and indeed pandemics that it seemed many economies, both low income and high income, were not well prepared for. And currently that's very topical in terms of the twin challenges that many countries are facing in terms of the health and economic consequences of COVID. But we have had recent episodes in history where countries have faced similar challenges, whether it's the Ebola epidemic in West Africa and the episode that we studied, the Zika pandemic that struck throughout the Americas in 2015. So of course, all epidemics vary. The epidemiological characteristics of those epidemics vary, the extent to which transmission goes from human to human or through some other mechanism, the extent to which the virus may be contagious or not. So there's lots of ways in which epidemics and pandemics vary from each other. But there are also many common ways in which we as economists and epidemiologists, and together we can study these problems. So we all think of these as potentially very fast-moving shocks to the economy as a whole, to individuals, both on the health dimension. A key policy response is often one related to social distancing, but another important policy response is often trying to provide households with information about risks and various types of preventative action they can take. And so those are very much at the fore of our work examining the Zika epidemic, where we essentially take tens of millions of administrative records from the Brazilian Health Service and hospital records to really understand how did both households respond to new information about the Zika virus, as well as how did health professionals respond to the new information that was provided. So we're able to do this over a very long time frame. We're able to do this for a few years prior to the epidemic to get a sense of how naturally people were behaving along various margins. And then we essentially focus in on the course of the epidemic, dividing it up into 2 time periods and then comparing those 2 time periods with earlier years. So in the first of those time periods, runs from about 6 months in 2015, from sort of the spring of 2015 to the middle of the fall. It was well recognized that the Zika virus was present in Brazil. It was being transmitted by mosquitoes to individuals, but it wasn't thought to target a particular part of the population or to have any adverse consequences on individuals. It was thought to be very much like a dengue-like virus that mosquitoes were passing on, and Brazilians are well familiar with the dengue virus. Then over time, over the course of 2015, it became more apparent that there may be some more serious implications of the Zika virus that hadn't been previously recognized. And this culminated in mid-November, where there were increasing reports of congenital malformations being caused, being linked to individuals who had been infected by the Zika virus. So the primary at-risk population were women who were pregnant. And the implications were through congenital malformations, the most prominent of which was microcephaly, where a child is born with a head circumference which is more than 2 standard deviations below international standard, so in the bottom 1 or 2 percentile of the global distribution of head circumferences. And so in the middle of November, the WHO and the Brazilian government quickly put out official warnings alerting people to the association between Zika infection and microcephaly. And so we used that particular timing of that information that was presented, which is somewhat similar to information that's been provided to individuals in the current crisis, to try to understand how did households at risk respond to the crisis. How did they respond to the information that was revealed? By having these 2 time periods allows us to look in a little bit more detail at 2 different aspects of how people respond to information. The first is before this link was established, but it was well known that Zika was prevalent in Brazil, we're able to identify the pure biological effects of the Zika virus. That if we assume that people don't change their behavior just because of the Zika virus being around and being thought to be like dengue, we can get some estimate from our administrative records of what is the impact of the virus on birth outcomes. And that provides a contribution to some of the epidemiological and medical literature to understand the pure effects, the biological effects of the virus on outcomes that we're concerned with. So what is the impact on, say, the incidence of microcephaly without having first order changes in how individuals at risk are behaving? And the second sort of time window that we're able to then study is that subsequent to the information being provided, we're able to then look at some of the behavioral responses of households who might be at risk and how they change their behavior, either to prevent themselves being infected in the first place. And the number one mechanism that you can do to avoid the risk is not to become pregnant in the first place. But then also to try to study how do people who are pregnant at the time this information is revealed, how do they change their behavior subsequently over the course of the pregnancy in terms of the types of tests that they go for, the use of ultrasounds, the use of abortion, other types of changes in behavior that could potentially be induced. And then to put all this together to say, well, what is the overall impact on children's outcomes as a result of this? On the flip side, we also use our administrative records to understand how individuals in the health service are responding to this type of information. So how were they previously treating pregnant women once this information is revealed? Given that there is no test for Zika at the time, there is no cure for Zika, what were the types of tests that were conducted, how effective were those tests, and how long did it take for the health service also to respond to the crisis? So it's really trying to understand over the course of an epidemic, a fast-moving epidemic where information is being released, some bits of information known, others very much are unknown, how do both households and the health sector respond to the crisis? So Zika differs from the COVID epidemic in a couple of key ways. The first is that it's transmitted by viruses, by mosquitoes. There isn't an issue of human-to-human contact. So social distancing measures don't need to be put in place for Zika. The sort of key policy response is one of providing information to households that are at risk in order for them to take actions that might prevent them becoming infected with the virus in the first place. But that still leads us to ask questions: who is responsive to this type of information? On what margins are they able to respond? How heterogeneous are those responses? And how long does it take before people return back to normal and sort of pregnancy rates return back to what they might have been absent the epidemic?
Yeah, so let me stop here. So I read the paper and it's like fascinating because first of all, it's very long because the results are like so many. So I urge our reviewers to have a serious look here. But can you please, before we go to the role of information and how it compares to today, because I think today we have 2 issues with COVID. One is not enough information, at least in the early stages of the virus. And then actually one could say we even have misinformation, which my understanding it was not the case in Brazil. But before we go there, can you please give us like a snapshot of the results? So which type, so what was the average effect, which kind of families and women got more responsive, so at least we put the results into perspective, please?
So our primary outcome is conception rates. So what share of women in a certain age group are becoming pregnant at any given moment in time. And in the administrative records that we have in Brazil, we're able to identify that very precisely, almost down to the week in which it's estimated that the conception took place. And so what we find is that prior to this information alert, there was no change in fertility rates, just in response to people knowing about Zika, but without this link to congenital malformations. As soon as the announcement is made, within a day, within a week, we observe a significant reduction in conception rates. On average, for the next 6 months, conception rates fall by about 7% relative to what we otherwise would have expected for the same time of year based on what the conception rates in earlier years. And that effect is very dynamic. It takes about 9 to 12 months before conception rates return back to where they were prior to this information. In terms of heterogeneous responses, we find that the drop in conception rates is primarily driven by higher SES individuals, so higher SES women. So the effects could go either way. You could say potentially they could have taken other actions apart from avoiding pregnancy altogether to offset these risks. But we find the effects are really driven by those higher educated individuals, higher SES women. And the reason for that is that individuals, when they're choosing when to have children, that's co-determined by other decisions that they're making, such as labor supply choices, other choices related to household behavior. So for lower SES women, we think that it's actually becoming harder for them to delay fertility relative to what they otherwise would have done. And so they're more exposed to the risk because of that. Now, one way that we can disentangle, is it the case that higher SES women just have more access to information, that's why they're responding, is to do the following analysis. We can take all records, all birth records prior to the alert and post the alert, and then run the following analysis. And if you take the records before the alert, you can then see, conditional on you becoming pregnant and giving birth, what is the likelihood of your child being born with microcephaly? That's very low, but in tens of millions of birth records, it's possible then to look at those risk ratios in different groups. And so as you would imagine, higher SES women, conditional on becoming pregnant, are actually at a lower risk of giving birth to a child with microcephaly. And so there are big sort of gradients, socioeconomic gradients, before the information is announced. When you look at the same sample after, even though there's differential selection into these groups, you see an equalization of those risk ratios across different groups, suggesting that lower SES women who continue to give birth after the announcement is made are changing their behavior during pregnancy to avoid the risk of being infected in the first place. And that makes sense. The cost of avoiding bites or mosquito bites during pregnancy is relatively low. It's a matter of using repellents, of wearing certain clothing. The costs of doing that are relatively low relative to the cost of avoiding or delaying pregnancy altogether. And so we do find evidence that everybody's responding to the information in terms of protecting themselves conditional on becoming pregnant, but there are large differences across households in terms of who is able to delay pregnancy, and that the cost of that delay seems to be higher for lower SES households. Now, the reason why information and health is such an important topic is not just because of epidemics, but more generally, we think of information as being a key tool for how we want to improve people's health behaviors. One great puzzle in the health economics literature is that the way that people respond to information when it comes to choices over health often is very different to how they respond to information in many other aspects of life or in other markets. And there are many instances where people tend not to take on board information that might suggest they have greater risks associated with the various types of behavioral types of consumption. So it is reassuring to find that when the risk becomes very large and it potentially is a new risk, it's a very highly advertised risk, we do actually find big changes in behavior across the population. People do respond to this type of information. However, in the paper, we also study those individuals who had become pregnant prior to the announcement, perhaps just a week or 2 weeks before the announcement, and so still had the opportunity to change their behavior over the course of pregnancy, potentially by having more ultrasounds, potentially having greater abortions. We don't see many changes in behavior amongst that group of individuals who are at risk, have information and have the possibility to adjust on these margins. We don't find much evidence that people who are already, in some sense, pre-exposed do respond to this information. So this suggests that information might be targeted or tailored to different groups in different ways, that a one-size-fits-all policy might not be so effective. There are still, even in times of crisis, where a lot of new information is provided, the risks are quite high, the vulnerable groups can be well identified, there still might be some individuals who choose not to act on that information. And that may be down to other factors that have been documented in the earlier literature, that there's interesting interactions between various psychological traits or behavioral biases that people might have and how they respond to information when it comes to health. So I think that there are some important policy implications there, and so that those are the main responses that we find on the health on the household side of things.
So Imran, actually, I have a question related to your point here. So did the government of Brazil target its campaign, I guess, to those women of low socioeconomic status that did not adjust much, or it was a common message across the country?
It was a common message that was provided both by government and by various media organizations. So in the paper, we document the extent to which people were exposed to this information through some of the main newspapers. We also document that people started searching on Google, for example, to a much greater extent just after the announcement was made, but people weren't really searching for information related to Zika or even repellents prior to this. So we think the information was transmitted in a relatively homogeneous way. Nobody could, before the crisis, anticipate which households were going to respond more or less. I mean, from a theoretical point of view, you could imagine it could go either way. So there's very much a blanket coverage that was provided to all. Brazil offered slightly different advice than some other countries in terms of taking a firm line in not necessarily encouraging people to delay pregnancy, but just making people aware of the risks. Whereas other countries are more explicit that given that the at-risk population is so well defined, that we would really advise you to take certain steps in terms of delaying pregnancy. That wasn't the case in Brazil. Perhaps there were slightly more mixed messages, or not, the message wasn't so emphatic. But certainly people had access to that, and there's evidence in the paper that people knew about that. Similarly, on the health side of things, we're able to document how doctors were recording their meetings with pregnant women differentially and what was being recorded in their notes. And so we see lots of response on the health service side as well.
So thinking now more about COVID-19, what do you think? I mean, personally, I find this discussion about external validity is misguided in the sense that Brazil is a very big country. The Zika was an important epidemic, so it's of vital importance to understand the implications of the Zika in Brazil. And actually, it is becoming nowadays, I think, clear that we can learn a lot from history. And as you nicely pointed out in your introduction, there have been many epidemics that perhaps people in Western societies didn't pay that much attention because they were happening in some part of Sierra Leone or some part of Congo or some part in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. I think we can learn from those incidents. But thinking more about today, what do you think are the takeaways, if you were to come with 2-3 takeaways of Brazil's experience in late 2015 with the Zika epidemic?
So let me just reiterate that the epidemiology of the Zika epidemic is very different from Ebola, it's very different from COVID, and so there are always going to be those elements that mean that the optimal policies might be different. But I think what's common in all of these crises is that the information needs to be provided to households. And so one thing that we try to look at in the paper is to use the variation across different states in Brazil to say that, in some of them there's more trust in newspapers, in some of them there's more trust in government. Do those types of aggregate state level factor then correlate to how much people respond to this information? And so one striking feature that we document is that in Brazilian states where there's more trust in media, that's where the response of households in terms of reduced conception rates is greater. People are more likely to delay pregnancy in those places where trust in media is greater. So clearly, it's not just about the message, it's also about the messenger. And I think that's a common feature that may be important to take on board. Thinking about different crises, thinking about the current crisis, that people need to trust the information that's being provided. Now, how we think of that trust being established and being maintained, there may be many different elements of that. It's not just literally who is communicating information. It might be the extent to which that information is ambiguous or contradictory or seems to be being shaped by factors that individuals might have more doubts over. So there's lots of elements for us as economists to understand where does trust in information sources come from? How does that evolve in a time of crisis where everybody accepts that not everything is going to be known and when we want to have credible information being provided? I think the paper is very important to show that there are very heterogeneous responses to the same information, even holding levels of trust constant. Not all households will respond equally. And I think marrying that up with what we know in terms of behavioral economics, potentially, there's a large body of evidence to suggest if you want to get people, say, to comply with medicine that they should be taking, what do we know that might get households to take on board those kinds of messages? And so we already have that body of evidence to try to understand how might you target certain households. How might messaging particularly work? What other kinds of financial or other incentives might you need to provide to households in order for them to respond to information? So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have those types of study that are being conducted. The question is, would those also apply in a time of such crisis? And I think that's an ongoing debate. So I think in that element, we're seeing, in terms of, say, compliance with social distancing measures, there does seem to be some heterogeneity across countries, within a country, in the extent to which people are adhering to those measures. And we're also seeing very different responses by governments in the extent to which they're compelling individuals to socially distance, or whether they're providing individuals with information and then saying, look, subject to some constraints, we're delegating the final choice of exactly how they want to implement this to the population themselves. So, you can think of the Swedish model as being very much along those lines, versus other countries which have chosen sort of more top-down policies, if you want, for social distancing. So again, it won't be one size fits all. I think it'll be a little bit of time before we see, what were the impacts across these different approaches to providing information during the current crisis.
Yeah, I fully concur, and having read the paper recently, so to me there are also the analogy about trust in institutions like the media. I have worked a bit with Sergey Guriev on this, and when we started working, people told us, why shall an economist worry about these things? Shouldn't this be the job of policy science? And I think this is one opportunity where we need to be, as a profession, much more focused. And then the second point, which I think is very interesting, is that at the very beginning of the COVID-19 onset, people thought, oh, this is the great equalizer. It's a shock that will hit all segments of the society equally. But actually now, just a month or a month and a half after seeing its impact, at least outside China and the initially hit countries, we see actually that the response is very heterogeneous. So it's one thing that the shock is asymmetric, and another thing that the shock could be symmetric, but people, either because, as your work shows, different access to information or different characteristics before the onset, could have a significant effect.
Yeah, I mean, for COVID, it's very striking that, we think of sort of pre-existing health conditions are an important determinant of your risk of COVID. And so those pre-existing inequalities in health are being magnified by the current crisis. And on many dimensions that we look at, whether it's across genders, across people in different sectors, key workers, non-key workers, they're all being exposed to different amounts of risks. I mean, at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, we've been doing a lot of work on this and trying to understand the heterogeneous risk factors to the current crisis. And it's clear that on a whole range of dimensions, inequalities are potentially going to be widened, both within a generation, and then the chief concern is also across generations. What's going to happen, both in terms of children now who might not be graduating from high school, or won't have entered the labour market in the best conditions. We know there's lots of hysteresis when you enter the labour market from a recession, and from a macro point of view, who's going to pay for the crisis, and how will that be spread out over time? So I think there's lots of issues here. I mean, this is something that I never intended to work on. It's just, by chance that my work in Sierra Leone happened to be timed with the Ebola epidemic there, and that's how we really started this agenda, and similarly with the Zika crisis. But unfortunately, when you start working on these topics and you realize the extent to which these aggregate shocks can hit, you realize that most economies are just not resilient to these types of shocks. And so it's not something that can be ignored. We look at the trends over the last 30 years. The frequency and complexity of viral outbreaks is increasing. No matter which data set you want to look at, that's a fact, and the drivers of that are increased urbanization, rising temperatures, increased mixing of human and animal populations. We don't think any of those trends are going to be so easy to reverse, so this isn't a problem that's going to go away. And if, at the very least, this has been a wake-up call for us to understand, how do we try to make the economy more robust to that? Do we actually even have the tools by which to act very quickly, both in high and low-income settings, where we're faced with these twin challenges of a major evolving health crisis as well as an economic shock? I think those are all very challenging questions, but one in which economists have a key role to play in conjunction with data scientists, in conjunction with epidemiologists and many other disciplines. It's going to require a combined effort to really understand all of these issues.
I fully agree with that, and actually let me also communicate here to the viewers that we view as economists and business school professors from various subject areas of having a complementary role to what the epidemiologists and the doctors are doing nowadays. Let me conclude with my last question, since also your research touches upon political trust and trust on the media. We have seen nowadays a very peculiar, to say the least, response of the Brazilian government towards the COVID-19, with mixed messages coming from the president and from the governors and the recently fired health minister. So do you mind commenting on that?
I haven't been following the debate in Brazil to the same extent as in other countries. I understand that some of the information has been very different at different layers of the Brazilian government, but I'm not well enough informed to really comment on that. But clearly, having these very different messages can't aid people's decision making in these types of circumstances. So I think that homogeneity or trustworthiness of messages is often driven by how simple and consistent that message can be. And so clearly that might not be happening in Brazil to the extent that it could be, but time will tell whether how big an impact that really has.
Thank you, Imran. As you can see, also we have some unexpected issues here with because work is interacting with homeschooling.
Yeah.
So let me thank you again, Imran Rasul from University College London. Thank you very much for taking the time. We learned a lot from this work. And I also urge our viewers to have a close look at this paper. It's very rich, also documenting the impact on the healthcare system. And we look forward reading more about this line of research. We will also feature Oriana Bandiera, your co-author in the Ebola paper, where you look at the implications of the Ebola in Western Africa. And just to preamble, we'll have various colleagues from across the world discussing about other epidemics, because there is clearly a lot to be learned. Taking, of course, very seriously the differences and the idiosyncrasies of each virus, something that we all learn as time goes by today with COVID-19. And there are important lessons that can be drawn by the experience of other countries on the response. So Imran, thank you very, very much for taking the time. We understand that you are also doing homeschooling and trying to do the best and edit one of the top 6 academic journals. So thanks a lot for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.